Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to whoever is listening at the moment. I hope you're having or have had a good day. In this talk, I present my paper on the dynamics of MPs campaigning on Facebook in the lead up to the 2016 EU referendum, where citizens could choose to vote for the UK to remain or to leave the European Union. My talk is structured as follows. I first go over the relevance of this study, and I provide some kind of background in the form of a short review of relevant research. I thereafter describe the nature of this study and the data that I have collected and that I use to study MPs' campaign activity on Facebook. Next, I present the findings of my study, and I conclude with a discussion of these findings. So first up, background and relevance. This study is largely exploratory. In this short literature review, I therefore focus on the little that we do know to highlight where and how this study contributes to existing research. So first, a bit of background. What do we already know about how elite actors campaign in the UK? Now, we know that the majority of UK MPs now have official or public social media accounts. They primarily use these accounts to communicate about their mostly local and constituency performance, to manage impressions, and also to gain trust for the sake of support and re-election. We also know that the campaign communication of politicians increases in intensity near the end of the campaign. As political campaigns progress towards their end, there is generally a rise in campaign activity and engagement. Gradually, increased attention will be paid to the suitability of candidates standing for election and the choice of accepting or rejecting a proposal in the case of a referendum. In a referendum, a proposal is the focus of the campaign, and therefore, in a referendum campaign, the debate is likely to be affected by events rather than party politics. This increase in activity during the campaign and near to the end of the campaign is the case offline, in mass media, in the form of TV debates, campaigning on the streets, and so forth, but also on social media, although most research has focused on Twitter. We therefore know less about this dynamics on Facebook. Finally, we also know that social media content corresponds to mass media content. In many a case, we observe shovelware, where offline and mass media content is simply moved to the online realm to a greater audience to increase exposure. Now, we also know that politicians strategically communicate to persuade voters, to influence their behavior. They can use rhetorical devices such as emotion and argument for this purpose. From the perspective of effective intelligence theory, these devices can have an impact on voting behavior as they influence information processing and decision making. The use of emotion is especially interesting in the case of an event like the EU referendum campaign. EU referendum campaigning is said to have heavily featured facts, myth, and emotion, and especially fear. So what do we know about the use of argument, anxiety, and anger on Facebook during the campaign? We know that social media do not function as an ideal public sphere with little to no deliberation. This suggests that MPs may not regularly advance an argument on Facebook either. Concerning the use of anxiety and anger on social media, we know that emotion increases the chances of a post to become viral. It thus facilitates exposure. We know that anxiety urges risk aversion and anger urges risk taking instead, and that these emotions are evoked strategically in communication in general, and this includes social media too. And then finally, what do we know about the use of anxiety and anger in the 2016 UK EU referendum campaign? We do know that anger and anxiety is used in discourse about the EU and referenda, And we also know that the official campaign groups strategically used anger and anxiety in their campaign communication. In fact, anger specifically reinforces existing Euroscepticism. And since anxiety motivates caution, Remain supporters may have used fear to urge voters to vote to stay. So now about this study in specific. With this study, I aim to contribute to the literature about the campaign behavior of elite actors by providing insight into the dynamics of the campaign communication of MPs, the reactivity and the internal dynamic of their posting activity. I do this by analyzing the postings on MPs' Facebook pages, and I focus on two aspects of this activity, namely changes in posting activity, so the frequency with which MPs post or publish a post, and changes in the content of these posts. In this study, I investigate the use of argument, anger, and anxiety of MPs on Facebook in the EU referendum campaign. And the EU referendum campaign is not only a highly impactful event, it also presented a different political arena with unusual circumstances for MPs to communicate. It was not the usual election. And the Facebook page is a medium that has received less attention than Twitter. This study is exploratory. I consider the relationship between the campaign activity of MPs on these pages and developments during the campaign. And I have two research questions. One, was there an increase in activity as the referendum day grew near? I thus ask to what extent the content and the structure of EU referendum posts of MPs has changed during the campaign. Secondly, I ask, did events such as the murder of an MP lead to changes in this activity? I therefore analyze whether the campaign activity is influenced by external phenomena, such as changes in vote intentions of the general public and specific events. The data has been observed over time and includes a set of univariate time series covering the 126 days of the campaign as I define it between February 19 and June 23, 2016. There are two general classes for describing time series, and both are used in this study to measure how the dynamics and the content of the campaign communication is affected by the day of the campaign, two events, as well as changes in voting intentions, changes in support for Leave versus Remain. But in this short presentation, I will only present the results of the regression model for posting activity. I focused on the effects of two events, one which I believed to have had a marginal impact and the other to have a considerable impact on posting activity. The first is the news that the Queen allegedly supported Brexit, which is from March 9, 2016, and the second, the murder of Jo Cox on June 16. I consider the impact of changes in voting intention in terms of support for Remain versus Leave, and how this fluctuates during the campaign. In my study of the posting content, I focus on the overtime presence of anxiety, anger, and argument in the posts. This exploratory study is guided by several expectations, and which I can shortly summarize as follows. I expect the posting activity of the MPs to increase in intensity near to the end of the campaign. And I also expect an increased use of argument, anger, and anxiety at the end of the campaign. I expect the first event to cause a similar increase in activity and the second event to cause a decrease, and I also expect the activity of the MPs to be linked to changes in the poll of polls, which indicate changes in support for either Leave or Remain by the UK public. I will now briefly describe the data used and collected for this study. So I am using a unique data set designed for this study, and this data set consists of the Facebook posts of all active MPs out of the total 653 MPs in office at some point during the campaign. And the data set does consist of 34,256 posts, which were identified using a codebook. 369 MPs actually posted at least once about the EU referendum during the campaign period, And because I treat my data as time series, the day is the unit of analysis. Now my dataset has 4 outcome and 4 explanatory variables. The outcome variables I am using relate to posting activity, the number of posts published, whether the post contains an argument, whether the post contains words indicating anxiety, and whether the post contains words indicating anger. The explanatory variables include the day of the campaign, the first event, the second event, and changes in the poll of polls indicating support for Leave versus Remain. How about my findings? So in this section, I am presenting a number of graphs quite quickly, and I do encourage you to stop and pause the recording as needed. Now in this first graph, I show you changes in the number of posts. We can clearly see an increase in the number of posts near the end of the campaign. The first dotted line refers to the date of the first event, and the second dotted line refers to the date of the second event. And as expected, we see a drop in activity following the second event, the murder of the MP. Now this graph shows the changes in the poll of polls, which I used to create a vote intention variable, which is support for Leave versus Remain. Now on this graph, a positive number indicates increasing support for Remain, and a negative number indicates increasing support for Leave. And in this figure, we can observe that only the second week of May is when the public increasingly supports Remain instead of Leave. I conducted correlation tests using the raw data across the time series to test for a relationship between posting activity and changes in vote intention, but I find no association. So based on this graph, we cannot say that changes in support for Remain versus Leave is associated with posting activity. And this graph shows us changes in the number of posts and the number of posts with an argument during the campaign. And evidently, as the number of posts decreases after the second event, the murder, so does the number of posts with an argument. This graph shows how the average level of anger and anxiety fluctuates throughout the campaign. There is no clear increase or decrease as the campaign progresses. The graph also shows that the average level of anger and anxiety is actually quite low. On average, the posts contain no more than 1.5% anger or anxiety, which in practice really means that, on average, there are no more than 1 or 2 anger or anxiety words in each post. Now, there is not enough time to elaborately explain these results in the regression model, although I do invite you to pause the recording as needed. This table shows the results of the multivariate regression analysis with posting activity as the outcome variable and the 2 events and changes in vote intention as the explanatory variables. As we can see in this table, the news about the Queen and changes in vote intention of the public did not affect the posting activities of the MP because the DTX coefficient is not significant. However, Model 2b does suggest that the murder of the MP did have an effect on posting activity, again because the DTX coefficient is significant in this case. The significant Y-like indicates that yesterday's posting activity influences that of today, and the significant X-lags indicate that the murder caused a decrease in posting activities 2 days after the event. So this indicates a delayed effect. The news about the Queen and changes in the voting intention, however, did not affect the posting activity of MPs. So then the discussion. I find that in the last weeks of the campaign, posting activity increases. However, the proportion of posts with an argument compared to all posts and the use of anxiety and anger in the text of the posts do not increase at the end of the campaign. For anxiety and anger, this is underlined by the fact that the best fitting models for the overtime evolution of anger and anxiety indicate that there is no systematic variation throughout the campaign period. Comparing the effect of 2 events in particular, the news that the Queen was alleged to support Brexit, published by The Sun on March 9, 2016, and the murder of the MP Jo Cox on June 16, I find that MP's posting activity only corresponded to the latter event, the murder. The findings support the expectation of increasing campaign activity over time and in the late weeks of the campaign. Analyses of this time series data indicate little systematic overtime variation in the use of argument, anxiety, and anger during the e-referendum campaign period. This indicates that generally there are few patterns in the dynamics of this e-referendum campaign activity, and that except for the murder of the MP, external events do not have a short-term effect on this communication. I thank you for your attention and listening to this talk. And if you have any questions, you can find me on Twitter or you can email me at the provided email address. Thank you.